Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for The Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. I want to look at several different images today that were recently created during our San Francisco Spirit of the City workshop. I want to talk about something that I've talked about before on the Daily Critique, but I have some great visual examples today to really sort of drive the point home. And that is both the idea of the weight inside of a blank frame, so how the frame is weighted before we even add anything to it, and also the natural movement inside of the frame based on that weighting. If we look at this first visual example, we have two things that combine to create an enormous amount of weight inside of our frame before we even add any subjects to it. The first is natural law, that's gravity, so the top of the frame has an enormous amount of weight relative to the bottom just because of the law of gravity. And then because of the way that we read in the West, we've been trained over and over again through our education and then looking at all types of two-dimensional media on a page, whether it's a printed page or virtual page on the internet. We've been trained to go to the top left and then read the page from left to right, working our way down to the bottom right. It's not just this idea of gravity and how we read. It goes a lot deeper than that from a psychological standpoint, because the movement inside of the frame is more natural for us from left to right. We get a very different feeling about subject matter within the frame if we can read it from left to right versus movement that happens from right to left. Movie makers have known this for a very, very long time, and because of that, in movies, the good guys, the protagonists, the hero, so much of the time, will move in from the left-hand side of the frame and go to the right. So this is natural for us to follow that kind of movement, so it feels better. And the bad guys, the antagonist, the anti-hero, a lot of times in motion pictures will enter from the right and move to the left. It's so much easier for us to understand things from a chronological standpoint. It feels more natural for things to play out from left to right. And then psychologically, depending on how this movement shows up in our images, it's going to have a big effect on just how we feel about what we're seeing. I just really wanted to drive that point home today with some great examples that came up during the workshop. I want to say a huge thank you to Usha, who's an advanced photographer from Wisconsin, who created this triptych that we're going to look at. And Usha also created this portrait of a person that we were just meeting on a day where we went out into the city and did some street photography. This is at Fisherman's Wharf. And also a portrait of the same person that was created by John, who's an advanced photographer from California. Let's go back and look at the triptych first. We were doing the critique on the workshop and this triptych came up. What was really interesting is that I had a very, very hard time following the story. Even though once I slowed down to look at it, I could see that this is a triptych about chronological time, lapsing. Here's the surfer about to go in the water, here's the surfer going in the water, and here's the surfer in the water. It was very, very hard, even though intellectually I knew that's what was happening, to feel that way about the movement when I was looking at the image. Because even though chronologically this is in order from left to right, the surfer in the picture is actually moving against the grain of how I want to see the story play out from a natural standpoint. And so I just want to go away from this image and come back to it again, and just love to get your feedback on how you feel about this. The really interesting thing about knowing about this type of visual weight inside of the blank frame and the psychological impact of different types of movement within the frame is then we can either use this idea to create an effect that's unified or pleasing for the viewer, or we can use it to create a feeling of tension inside of the viewer. And what happens for me when I look at this triptych is, even though chronologically it's in order, I get quite a feeling of tension because of the actual movement of the surfer into the scene being from right to left. It's funny what happens to my mind's eye and to a lot of people in the workshop if we were just to flip this. Even though chronologically the movement is backwards, this actually feels more natural or more pleasing psychologically for me to look at, because of how powerful the idea of suggesting movement from left to right is for a psychological. I'm just going to go back and forth a couple of more times, give you a chance to see what you think. Would love to hear you weigh in about this. And now I want to look at another example, the portraits. It's amazing for me when I looked at this portrait and I was doing the critique, is I immediately got a sense of a story that I made up, which was a worker who wishes that he was somewhere else, but I totally sympathize with this guy. I looked and I read, okay, here's some beverages back here. Here's a counter. He's working maybe at a restaurant, because I didn't see this guy, I didn't meet him. I wasn't with Usha and John when they photographed him. So I almost immediately made up a story. Here's a worker, here's the space he's working in, and he's looking out in this direction. When I got over here, I sort of said, yeah, you know, he's at work, but he's thinking about the weekend or thinking about his next station in life or whatever. He's a young guy. I totally sympathize with him. I thought about bartending or waiting tables and how many times I was in that position, and I was thinking about getting my photography career going, and that was sort of the story that I made up. Now here's what's really interesting. John also photographed the same guy. It's a really cool portrait, just like Usha's. I love both of the portraits. But I immediately got a totally different feeling because of the framing here, because of the elements of the story and the direction that he's looking. One of the things that happens here is that the elements of the story actually play out backwards. So we have the environment that might give us a clue as to what he's doing here at this counter, which is the beverages over here. We also have a tip jar. But in this case, because these subjects are on the other side of him, I almost get the feeling that he's a customer and not a person working in the store. So the story for me is backward and doesn't quite play out in the same way in my mind. And now in this case, he's pointing from right to left. And instead of sympathizing with him, when I look at him, I sort of question his motives. In this case, I'm questioning sort of where this person is coming from. Where for me, on the other shot, I totally sympathize with him. Granted, the exposure is a little different, so the fact this is lighter is having an effect, and the fact that the expression is a little different is also having an effect. Here the head's seemingly a little more tilted, but going back and forth here again, I'd just love to hear your feedback on how this idea of orientation, subject matter chronologically playing out, and also just movement is having an effect on you psychologically as the viewer. The more I get into the idea of design, the more I'm amazed at the power of these concepts. And one of the things I'd really encourage you to do is at the level of the camera to pay attention to these things. It's cool if you know them, because then you can decide whether you want to create a feeling of unity for the viewer or whether you want to create a feeling of tension. This is just one of the ways that you could approach those two ideas of unity versus tension. And the other thing at the level of editing that I would encourage you to do to help your mind to get your conscious mind around this, because so much of this is happening at the subconscious level for both us as photographers and the viewer of our work, is to flip your images. I'm constantly flipping my images from left to right and up and down and sort of seeing what changes as far as the psychological impact. I want to say a huge thank you to John and Usha for being kind enough to share their work in the context of the Daily Critique. I want to say a big thank you to all of the people who participated in the San Francisco workshop. We had a great time, and I want to send out a huge thank you to the universe for the fact that our dear friend Wes is recovering as I speak right now in the intensive care unit. Wes was on the San Francisco workshop, and just really happy to know he's made it through his surgery and that he's doing well. Hope to see all of you again real soon on the Mindful Eyes Daily Critique.